Hey YouTube, how's it going? Kevin Cleary with a knife video. Today I want to do a comparison between two knives that are hard use, that are fairly high-end or fairly expensive, and are sort of some of the knives that really kind of pushed off the hard use, overbuilt sort of fad. The first one is the Hinderer XM18, very well built knife, little hefty little guy, and the other is the Strider SMF, not so little. Certainly still overbuilt with thick slabs of titanium, or thick slab of titanium, and in this case CPM 154 and G10. Again, so both very well built knives, both very popular knives. Probably both knives that that a person who's kind of looking to make that first higher end purchase may be considering. Now, a few years ago, we could definitely say these would be two competitors. That area of the market, so the high-end production / mid-tech market, has really grown in the last, 2.5, 3 years. And really, it started growing before that, but it's really kind of taken off where there's all kinds of companies now coming in with very high-end, very high-priced stuff that is, very extremely well made, extremely high-end materials, and so there's a wider spectrum to consider these days than there was even just a couple of years ago. But I still think for a lot of people these represent some quintessential high-end hard-use blades. And so let's go ahead and do a rundown of how these two compare with / compete with one another. We'll start off with size and weight the way we normally do. The XM18 is 5.5 ounces. It's 8.25 inches overall. The blade here is 3.5 inches and the handle is 4 3/4. It is also 1/2 inch thick. In fact, just a teeny bit more than 1/2 inch thick, but not even worth mentioning. Okay, so that's the XM18. The other knife we want to consider is much bigger. This is the Strider SMF. It is 9 inches. Okay, so fairly large knife. The blade on that is just over 3 7/8, and the handle is 5 1/8. Okay, so overall we get 9 inches. The weight on this is a little heftier at 6.1 ounces. Okay. Now, when you compare the difference in size, this is 3/4 inch larger. Not only that, but there's more substantial handle and blade stock. I think, frankly, the SMF coming in at 6 ounces is rather an achievement. Okay, so I'm not suggesting that weight is out of line for the size of knife that this is, and for the size and the dimensions of the materials that are used in it, okay? Now, having said that, when we compare these two in terms of size and weight, what I always think about is how much am I carrying in my pocket, how much room is it taking up, how much weight is it adding, and what am I getting for that size and weight, okay? And when we do that kind of a comparison between these two knives, sorry, I had a little itch there, I've got to tell you the Hinderer, I think, comes out on top. You're getting a blade that's every bit as tough. You're getting a design that's every bit as tough. You're sacrificing a little bit of reach, but not a whole lot. And you're getting just as much, in fact, maybe a little bit more blade length for less weight and considerably smaller size, especially if we fold these down and compare them in the configuration that we'd actually be carrying them. You can see the Strider is quite a bit bigger, okay? So you're getting a lot of pocket space used up here and a fair bit of weight. Well, you're not really gaining anything over the blade on the XM18. Now, moving on to the blade, which is what we always talk about next. Let's start off with the Strider, because there's probably a little more to say. I don't know, maybe not. There's a lot to say about the Hinderer as well, but we'll come back to that. So Strider, this blade is CPM 154, very good steel. Now, that's not the same in every SMF, okay? There's a bunch of different steels you might get. Now, I will say this, they're always going to be high-end, high-performance steels, okay? So you're not going to buy a Strider and it's going to have, like, I don't know, HCR 13 MOV or AUS 8 or something like that. It's always going to be, CTSX HP or S30V or S35VN or CPM 154 or others, okay? Lots of good steels out there, and obviously Strider is going to pick one of them to use. In this case, the other variation we need to talk about is the blade shape. This is the 3/4 ground rather than the full flat grind or the Tanto or a number of other blade shapes you could get. I like this one the best because I find it has the best edge geometry, okay? And so based on that, we'll talk about this blade in particular, okay? Some of the other blades I find they would be fine if the knife was only going to be a defensive option, but for EDC tasks, they do not cut that well, all right? So that's the SMF. What about the Hinderer? Well, again, we have a bunch of different blade shapes. All right, there's the Spanto, there's the slicer grind, there's the spear point, there's the Skinner, there's the Wharncliffe, and I may be forgetting one. I think that pretty well covers all of them, though. So again, a number of blade shapes available. The difference is all of them will be S35 VN, which is cool. This blade stock is not as thick as the Strider. Okay, I'll try to get these two open kind of side by side. All right, this one is a full 3/16 of an inch. This one is not quite. It's maybe about a 32nd over an eighth, so kind of somewhere in between an eighth and a 16th. Still a very robust blade, still very heavy stock. Both of these would be knives that, although I never recommend this, you may be able to do some prying work with. However, the sacrifice to that is, and I would say it's a little more of a sacrifice with the Strider than the Hinderer, you often get a very thick blade behind the edge. So you've got a lot of material. You know, if you think of a knife that's coming down and then forming a secondary bevel like this, you know, on these knives, you've got more material back here, more material on the initial grind, and often a more obtuse secondary bevel. That is a more open secondary bevel. Now that makes for a very tough grind, but it makes for a knife that does not slice very well. Okay, a knife that doesn't do your average EDC tasks well. All right, now both of these have been profiled to 20 degrees per side or 40 degrees inclusive and work much better that way. And I would recommend, if you're going to buy one of these, either one really, that you plan on either yourself or sending it to someone who knows, who's very good at sharpening and who can reprofile that blade to a more suitable EDC angle for you. I want to say Solo Knife Reviews or Johnson Knives just did, I think there's a video that discusses, you know, laying that edge back and the value of it, especially on higher end steels where they can take that. Okay, so you don't have to take my word for it. You can go watch a whole nother video that discusses nothing but the value of steepening that angle on the secondary bevel, and I think it's a worthwhile thing to do. So those are the blades. Now, which blade am I going to prefer? Both of these are very tough blades. Both of them are fairly utilitarian. Both of them, as I've said, need to be reprofiled to be suitable for the kind of tasks I want my knife to do. Okay, so because of all that, I'm going to call it a tie. Okay, you got a little bit more edge, cutting edge on the Hinderer, but very, very little, and so not really worth considering, I don't think. Again, you've got a little bit more width, a little bit thicker stock on the SMF, but again, not really enough to make a difference. So for that reason, I'm going to say the blades are basically equal in performance and in utility and kind of what you're going to get out of them, and I don't really think one beats out the other. Now, let's move on to lockup and deployment. Here's an area where there's a little more difference. Both of these, of course, are titanium frame locks. Okay. Both of them do work exceptionally well. Very, very solid. Both of these are extremely solid. But I do need to say a couple of things about each. Each has their own little sort of idiosyncrasy. Number one, the Hinderer is not known to be a great flipper. It will flip, so it can work, but it doesn't flip well. It doesn't have a strong enough detent to really fly out of the handle. You sort of have to do it with some intentionality, whoops, and you can still fail. A lot of guys, myself included, will normally use just a little bit of a wrist flick to make sure that you get a good solid deployment every time. The Strider, on the other hand, well, it has no flipper at all. It is fairly smooth, but I can get this out pretty quickly if I need to. I'm not going to be able to do it for you on camera because it as well requires a little bit of wrist action. It's not as smooth as the Hinderer. Okay, let's see if I can demonstrate that for you. You know, even though this is a Teflon washer, knife. There's no ball bearing pivot in here. You can see that it does fall close under its own weight. The Strider, I can kind of get it to, but not nearly as easily. Okay, so the Hinderer gets it for being a little bit smoother. The Strider has another idiosyncrasy though. In the older models of this, you will often run into what's called lock rock, where the lock doesn't interface properly with the tang of the blade, and that was primarily because of the convex grind they were putting on there. And so I guess concave grind really. Yeah, concave, anyway, because of the rounded grind on the tang of the blade, you would often see older models start to develop some lock rock. Now you could always send them back to Strider, and you still could. Like if there's something happened to this knife, I broke the blade off, I could send it back to Strider. They'd replace the blade. I'd have to pay them something, but still, they're really good about that. It may take a little while, but in my experience, they've been quite good. Okay, you might get some issues with the lock on the Strider. Not always, and if you do, they will fix it. Now it's better. Okay, nowadays the Striders use a flat angle on the blade tang, which does allow for more reliable engagement with the lock face. Okay, so there's how those two compare, and really. I've got to say that the Hinderer takes the cake on this one. Number one, it's quite a bit smoother. Okay. Number two, it is faster whether you use thumb studs. You know, if I compare apples to apples, now I can't do it, of course. The Hinderer is fairly quick to deploy with thumb studs. Strider, not quite as quick. You can do it fairly quickly, but it doesn't really flick that well, especially on camera. Now I can flick it open if I'm standing up away from the camera, but it's not as easy as the Hinderer. The other thing is the Hinderer tends to be a little more reliable with their lock construction and engagement. So lockup and deployment, both very solid, both very reliable, both titanium frame locks. The Hinderer is a little smoother and a little faster and a little more comfortable to actuate, and so for those reasons I'm going to give it to the Hinderer. Next, we need to move on. We've talked about the blade, we've talked about lockup and deployment. As we kind of move down the blade, as we move down the knife, we get to the handle next. Both of these are, once again, same materials, G10 and titanium. The Strider, I think a really cool idea, the way they do it, is just all G10 on the show side and titanium slab on the other. It is that beautiful flamed titanium. I think it looks really, really cool what Hinderer does with these. Now, this is the Lego version, so it's very squared off. There are other handle shapes on the Strider. There's the one they call the double gunner grip. There's the one they call the concealed carry, which is very smooth. The Lego is the most square of them, and probably, I'm guessing a little bit here, I have had a concealed carry in my hand one time. It was more comfortable than this. This is not uncomfortable, but it's not, you don't get it in hand and go, wow, this feels great. Okay, it's just a little squarish and a little angular in its construction. The Hinderer does mold right into your hand. I will say the ergonomics on this are very, very good. You don't get those square edges. The jimping is perfect. The finger choil at the front is amazing. Now both of these, when we talk about just ergonomics in general, both of them do have the choil. This is another subtraction on the Strider for me. I feel like there's a lot of wasted space here. This choil is like the size of a Bigfoot finger. You could have moved this back 1/8 of an inch. You could have added 1/8 of an inch to the blade here. In fact, you could have even reworked this plunge grind and done that differently and had more blade as well. You could easily add a good 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch to the blade length on a Strider, and I have no idea why they don't do it. Anyway, not the end of the world. Both do allow for that variation where you can choke up on the knife and do some more detailed cutting, and I really, really appreciate that about both. I will say the Strider in this grip is a little more comfortable, a little more controllable because the blade stock is very thick. You've got a lot of purchase for your thumb there, and so this is really, really nice. This is still nice. This feels just amazing. Like it's like this was just made by shaking hands with someone, and So it's really, really well done. Choking up is not quite as good, okay? It's still good, but not as stellar as back here. So the grips are both reasonably comfortable. Certainly the Hinderer is more comfortable. Let's talk about the pocket clip. Both pocket clips extremely functional. No complaints at all about these spring clips. Hinderer is single position right there. That's it. I mean Strider. Let's get the names right. So Strider is single position. There it is. Right side tip up carry, no other option. I suppose you could buy a left-handed option. Hinderer, you have tip up, tip down, but again, no reverse option. You'd have to buy a left-handed one. Okay, so there you go. By the way, in terms of ergonomics, I would definitely give it to the Hinderer. That's going to be a little more of a win. The one thing I will say you get with the Strider is more reach. Okay, if you really are in a situation where you think you need to be able to reach out and touch something or someone, you do get that to a greater extent with the Strider, because it almost has a third position. There's sort of normal cutting position here, choked up, and then even kind of choked down as well. Okay, so there is a little more variation. So that takes care of that. Sorry about all the beeping. My phone is making noises over there. Just ignore that. Overall, both of these are really cool, really well-built knives. Okay, if I met someone on the street and they said, "Hey, check this out, I've got an SMF," I'd be like, "Dude, that's an awesome blade, right?" I would want to fondle it and check it out and see the edge and maybe open it and close it a couple times. And if someone said they had an XM18, same thing. Okay. Both of these are not the only model. There's an XM24, there's an Eclipse. From Strider, there are a number. There's the SNG and the SMF, which are the two more popular. There's another smaller one. I just can't think of the name of it. These two seem like the one. These are the ones that I'm most interested in, the only ones I'll likely own. I couldn't see myself being interested enough to buy any other Strider. I would maybe buy an XM24 if the opportunity presented itself. But who do I declare the winner out of these two? Or if someone called me up and said, "Hey, I'm looking at both these knives, they're pretty well the same price, which one should I buy, used or something like that?" I'm probably going to recommend for most people to buy the XM18. Okay, that's the one I would prefer. If you said you have to give one of these up, I would definitely give up the SMF over the XM18. Not that this is not a great blade, not that I don't enjoy owning it and using it and carrying it. It's a very, very well done knife. All right. There are some maybe personal factors that come into this as well. I'm not going to spend any time on this, but there are some questions about some of the things that Mick Strider has done and said. And maybe there's that personal bias because of Rick Hinderer having that background as a firefighter. There you go, guys. That's my take on these two very, very cool, very, very popular blades. One more time before we go, give you a good shot of the two of them. And we'll talk to you soon.